We continue this afternoon with the addresses of the Honorable Camillo Gonsalves, Senator and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade, Commerce, and Information Technology of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Excellencies, Ambassador, Madame Chargé, the Honorable Speaker of the OECS House of Assembly, Panel Campbell QC, compañeros y compañeras, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. This address is going to be very brief. Not because, and I hear cheering in the audience already, not because I don't have a lot to say about these subjects that we're commemorating today, some proud and some tragic, but because Parnell Campbell QC has done such a magnificent job in laying out the case of the Cuban Five, that really everything that I had to say has already been said by Parnell. And the other reason is since I've made such a positive impression on him the first time, I don't want to mess it up by speaking too long this time. I'd rather he stick with that positive first impression. The Cuban independence wars are known to every primary school history student in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and in the wider Caribbean, because of their signal importance in the development not just of Cuba, but of the Caribbean. We in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines had our own independence wars. They were called derisively by the British the Carib Wars. And we lost those wars. And it was not until the extermination and exile and genocide of the Kalinago and the Garifuna that the descendants of enslaved Africans managed to see the independence that they fought for when the British arrived on our shores. But we all take great pride in the successful wars of independence in the region, particularly that of Cuba and of course of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. And these are independence wars of which we have tremendous pride. There is nothing that I can say about Comandante Ernesto Che Guevara that has not been said more eloquently, not only by Parnell, but by its numerous biographers, and the fact that he is an icon of the revolutionary spirit, and that everyone can relate to him on some level because of the energy, the commitment, the passion, the discipline that he brought to the liberation struggles not only of Cuba, but of the entirety of Latin America and even Africa. That takes us then to the issues of terrorism. And the two here are linked. Cubana Airline Flight 455 was bombed in an act of terrorism off our waters, essentially, just off Barbados, by a man called Luis Posada. And I remember as a little boy, one of my very first memories as a child was in 1976. I was about 4 years old. I was on the first Cubana flight to Cuba after the bombing, and with my mother and father. And I remember very few things about it. I remember one thing in particular: we had the entire plane to ourselves, because no one else was flying on Cubana at the time. And I thought as a little boy that it was a wonderful thing that I had the entire plane that I could run up and down. But I also remember my mother's tension on the flight. She was very tense. I would say afraid. Because here we are immediately after the bombing of a flight, getting on a flight to fly to Cuba. And it was a nerve-wracking experience for her. And even as a little boy, I remember I fed off of that tension. So as much as I had the entire plane to myself, I couldn't enjoy it as much as a little boy usually would, because of that heinous crime. And it is even more heinous because the perpetrators of that crime are known, they have admitted their role in the crime, and they remain free and in the protection of the authorities of the United States of America to this day. We have learned in recent years, in recent weeks, that the United States of America is one of, if not the most, active practitioners of espionage in the world. We knew it already, in one sense or another. But Edward Snowden's revelations have proven to us that the United States of America spies on everyone. They spy on friendly governments, because it was proven that they spy on the European Union and the British. They spy where they shouldn't be spying, because Snowden proved that they spy even in the halls of the United Nations. And they spy on their own citizens, because it has been proven that they have, the NSA, the National Security Agency, has a massive network that monitors emails, telephone calls, credit card purchases, travel, and so on, back and forth. So they know why they spy, and they know the benefits of espionage. And in some cases, people make distinctions in types of espionage. They say spying on another government, particularly a friendly government, is a bad thing. You should trust your friends. And spying on your own citizens is a bad thing, particularly in a country that has such vaunted constitutional principles protecting the rights of privacy of citizens. But very often people say, if you're spying on terrorists, that's not a bad thing. And in the wake of 9/11, people have come to understand the importance of surveillance and espionage against terrorists. In the wake of 9/11, the CIA went on a recruiting drive to find people who spoke Arabic and who looked Arab, so that they could go into countries and infiltrate Al-Qaeda cells to spy against them and return that information to the United States. And it's not spying against a government. This is spying against terrorist cells in foreign countries to protect your citizens. And everybody agrees that that is okay. Because you're not spying on a government, you're not spying on your citizens, you are doing surveillance to protect your own people against terrorist attack. And the United States is one of the leading practitioners of this. They have spies in Afghanistan. They have spies in Iran. They have spies in Saudi Arabia. They have spies in the Gulf states. They have spies in Somalia. They have spies everywhere that terrorism has reared its ugly head. The United States has spies operating to protect their citizens at home from terrorism. Because let's face it, the United States is a major target for terrorists. When Osama bin Laden was captured and killed, it was based on the intelligence provided by American spies in Pakistan who were spying against terrorist cells in Pakistan. And everyone applauded them. Not only the people who killed bin Laden, but the entire intelligence network that led to the capture and killing of this terrorist mastermind who had caused so much death and destruction. There is absolutely no difference between what the United States of America did to capture bin Laden and protect itself and what the Cuban Five were doing to protect the citizens and people of the Republic of Cuba. Cuba, at the time and still today, was the victim of an orchestrated campaign of terror beginning with the bombing of Flight 455, continuing with hundreds of attempts on the life of the President of Cuba, and manifesting itself in numerous bombings of hotels, disruptions of utilities, planes flying from Cuba into Cuban airspace, conducting their own surveillance, dropping flyers, all of it emanating from terrorist cells in the United States of America. And the Cuban Five did what patriots are doing all around the world. They risked their life to infiltrate terrorist cells to protect the people of their homeland. They did not, it has been proven, transmit one article of classified information about the government of the United States back to Cuba. No classified information was sent about the US government. They infiltrated terrorist cells to protect Cubans from future bombings and infiltrations. And when they shared that information with the FBI, that act in and of itself proved that they were not acting against the interest of the government of the United States of America. They called the government, they said, look, this is what we have. There are terrorists in your midst attacking us. You as a country that is anti-terrorist, we as victims of terrorism, we think we can work together on this thing. But what the FBI did with that information, which as Parnell Campbell indicated, they already knew. But what they found out from that information was who and how the Cuban Five were acting in the United States. So they say, you know about this. Well, how could they know that? They must have a plant in the Brotherhood group against Cuba. And how would they know this? They must be employed at this location. And they used the information that the Cubans provided them not to stop the terrorist acts, but to capture the people who provided the information to them. And they were convicted in what, to my mind, is the biggest political show trial in recent memory in the United States of America. Not since the Red Scare of McCarthy have people been convicted on such poor evidence and in such circumstances that offended due process rights as the Cuban Five in the United States of America. Look, Parnell Campbell has discussed a lot of this, and he's far better lawyer than I ever will be. So I don't want to dwell on too much of it. But a few examples. Compañero Gonsalves is serving 2 life sentences. One of the things for which he is convicted is murder, essentially. The prosecution, and we have a director of public prosecutions here, the prosecution tried to withdraw that charge because they said in their pleadings that there is not enough evidence to convict on that charge. The judge said in his instructions to the jury that you couldn't make that finding unless it happened in the territory of the United States, the act that they were accused of. The prosecution's own evidence said that it didn't occur in the United States territory. It either occurred in Cuba or at best in international space. So the prosecution tried to withdraw the charge, and in their pleadings they said there is not enough evidence to convict on that charge. And the jury still found them guilty. And having been found guilty on a charge that the prosecution wanted to withdraw, you got life. No other common law legal system could that happen. Nowhere else. And then there was an appeals process. And the court above the trial court was called the 11th Circuit Court of Appeal. And the three judges at the time on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeal unanimously said that the Cuban Five did not receive a fair trial, and that the trial must continue, must be restarted in a new location. They said that it was impossible for the Cuban Five to get a fair trial in South Florida. That same 11th Circuit Court, well, before I get there, it has been proven subsequently by the lawyers of the Cuban Five that not only was it natural anti-Castro feeling that was occurring in South Florida at the time, but that the government of the United States of America, and these are proven facts now, was paying journalists to write anti-Cuban Five articles at the time when the trial was about to begin. So the government of the United States of America was paying the media to create an environment that would be hostile and that it would make it impossible for the Cuban Five to get a fair trial. Now, the 11th Circuit Court says the trial is not fair. It did not occur in a fair environment. Do it over somewhere else. And the government made the extraordinary step of asking the 11th Circuit Court to reconsider its own decision and hopefully to come to a new decision. Now there are 12 judges on the 11th Circuit. 3 of them had already said unanimously that the trial was unfair. But when they reconsidered it, the whole panel, one miraculously fell out, and it became a 10-2 decision that no, the trial was absolutely fine. On second thought, they had a fair trial, and therefore they are convicted. These maneuvers are absolutely unprecedented in American jurisprudence. These are not just lawyer tricks that happen and you don't know about them. These are things that are unprecedented in American jurisprudence. The panel has already indicated that the Supreme Court of the United States has now refused to hear further appeals, despite all of the evidence indicating the unfairness of the original trial. The prosecution thinks, in their own pleading, that some of the things that these men were convicted of, they should not have been convicted of. Learned judges on the appellate court felt unanimously that the trial was unfair. There is a dispute, but the Supreme Court of the United States has said, we not touching that. Let them serve their time. In a time when the entire world is united in the war against terrorism, the continued incarceration of these gentlemen is a blot not only on the legal and constitutional standing of the United States of America, but on the conscience of the entire world. This is why so many people have spoken out so strongly. Even Americans, even Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States, has spoken out in favor of the Cuban Five. Why do we care? We know that we have a long and proud history of cooperation with Cuba. That's one reason to care. We know that Cuba is in our neighborhood. They are our brothers. That is one reason to care. But more than that, small states like ours have an obligation to speak when international law and international norms are violated. It is our duty to speak. Because without international law and international law norms, we do not exist. In times past, major powers would grab small states at will, and our survival was really based on whether or not either we were too insignificant or we had sucked up so much to some major power that they had decided to protect us. But there was no law that guaranteed our existence. In this modern world, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, which doesn't have an army to defend itself against invasion, owes its existence and the existence of our brother nations in CARICOM to the presence of international law. It is our bulwark against invasion, against disadvantage economically, against exploitation, against unfair trading regimes. All of it, our entire economic survival, the existence of our country as Saint Vincent and the Grenadines owes itself to robust international law. And whenever the world, especially powerful countries, deviate from that in any way, we must be alarmed and we must sound the alarm to say this is wrong. Because ultimately, if international law is ignored and violated repeatedly, it comes all the way down to us, And our own existence is weakened and cheapened every time there's a violation of international law. So we don't have access to grind, but we have a vested interest. If we believe in our own survival, we have a vested interest in sounding the alarm and being the watchmen and watchwomen of international law. The United Nations Committee on Human Rights has condemned the conviction of the Cuban Five. Jurists and scholars around the world have complained and traduced the United States judiciary for the decisions made in the conviction and continued incarceration of the Cuban Five. And it is absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt that these men are political prisoners and prisoners of war, but the war has long since ended. They are prisoners of the Cold War, even though the Cold War has ended. And we owe it to ourselves as citizens of small countries, as modern societies, as civilized people, as Caribbean people, to unite in solidarity in opposition to the continued incarceration of these gentlemen. A few years ago in New York, they caught a number of Russian spies who were spying against the government of the United States. Within weeks, they had effected a swap. The United States took their captured Russian spies and traded them with American spies in Russia. And the matter was solved. And that was spying against the government of the United States. These gentlemen have never spied against the government of the United States. These gentlemen spied against terrorists, and they shared their information with the government of the United States. But they are in jail, and the Russian spies are celebrities in their native country. It is worthy to note that two of these gentlemen in 15 years of incarceration have never been allowed, the United States has never granted visas for their wives to come and visit them. That is an inhumane act designed to further exacerbate the suffering of these gentlemen. We have to call on our friend and brother Barack Obama to do the right thing. We in the Caribbean have continually placed our hope in democratic presidents when it comes to the unjust and outmoded American policy against Cuba. When Bill Clinton was elected president, we thought that there would be a relaxation of the restrictions of the embargo against Cuba. Many of us were hopeful. Bill Clinton did not justify our faith. And then came the election of George Bush, where he won a legally disputed election by the slimmest of margins, based on which state? Florida. And in Florida, the Cuban community, the Cuban exile community in Florida, voted in lockstep with the Republican Party. So it is fair to say that by some analysis, the Republicans thought that they owed their presidency to local politics in South Florida, because the entire country's presidency turned on the Florida vote. You remember the counting with the hanging chads and all the rest of it? The pregnant chads. And the Republicans then said the Cuban community has to be appeased at all costs because we owe them the election. They were our most solid bloc, voting bloc in Florida. And then it became political conventional wisdom that you can't touch the Cuban policy because it may cost you the presidency. It is better to let that lie as is, because to touch it might affect your own domestic presidential political prospects. But our brother Barack Obama has won both elections so convincingly that he has enough of a cushion not to worry about domestic politics in Florida. And now more than ever, he cannot run for re-election, so he has even less reason to let narrow political interests come before doing the right thing. The international community has condemned the unjust embargo against Cuba every year for the last, how many years has it been? 21 years. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines votes proudly with the international community every year in condemning the embargo against Cuba. The embargo against Cuba was the brainchild of Jesse Helms, and people who, as Parnell said, maybe in another time may have felt they had some justification in doing that. But the embargo was never simply ideological, because if you read the act, the Helms-Burton Act, the only way that the embargo can be lifted, according to this act, is that one, as you would expect in this act, Cuba has to become a Western American-style democracy, even though the international community says it is illegal to interfere in the domestic affairs of other states. But that is one. The second thing is the thing that it always comes down to in these matters, is property. Because the Helms-Burton Act says that you cannot lift the embargo on Cuba until every exiled Cuba gets their property back or is compensated with money for the property that they lost in the revolution. Because, of course, there were a number of American interests who were evicted during the Cuban Revolution. And these people want back their money. And that, we know, is not going to happen. So does that mean that based on this act, we reduce ourselves to simply understanding that the embargo against Cuba will continue forever? No. We have to raise our voice, and we have to ask our friends around the world and within the United States to relax the embargo and to show positive signs of good faith towards Cuba. If the embargo is relaxed, not only Cuba benefits, the entire region benefits. In a time of economic crisis in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, in the Caribbean, in the world, the Caribbean owes it to ourselves to prioritize the issue of the Cuban embargo. Because Cuba could be an engine that could drive the entire region economically. Why would you support, as Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, a law that intentionally suppresses and compresses and contracts the economy of one of the states in your region? It has an effect on you. And in a time of crisis, we need all of our friends rising. Because when that water rises, all boats will be lifted when the water rises. So we have an economic interest. We have a moral interest. We have a solidarity interest. We have a political interest in lifting this Cuban embargo. President Obama has certain things that he can do. He can relax the rules about travel. He can relax the rules about how much money you can send back to Cuba. These are things that he doesn't need Parliament, Congress to do. He can do these things himself. And we have to say, as governments, President Obama, United States, you are our friend. We want you to know that this is a priority for us. That you do everything you can do to relax the embargo, the blockade against the people of Cuba. Why is it in this day and age that Cubans shouldn't be able to get health equipment? Because it is as a particular machine or a particular drug is made in the United States and that cannot be given to a Cuban. How is that logical in this day and age? And after we tell President Obama, as governments, we have to tell him as people who live in the United States. The biggest Vincentian city in the world is Brooklyn, New York. And we have to be able to tell, and the biggest Bajan city in the world is Brooklyn, New York. And the biggest Trini city in the world is Brooklyn, New York. And we also have population centers in Miami, large Caribbean population centers. And we have to act politically. Our friends and brothers and sisters who are registered voters in the United States have to be a counterweight to the voices that you hear from the Cuban exile community. And they have to say, as much as the Cubans are saying that continuing the embargo is a priority, our people who are living in the United States have to say it is a priority that you discontinue the embargo against Cuba. And all of us we talk to our friends and family overseas, and we have to let them know that this is a priority for us. It will help us at home. It is the right thing to do. Tell your political representative that this is not a distant, theoretical, esoteric matter. This is something that means bread and butter, right and wrong, to the people of our region. And when we have done that, we then have to tell our friend Barack Obama that what you can do immediately as a sign of good faith, as a sign that you will live up to all of the wonderful things you have said about diplomacy and conversation and collaboration with even your worst enemies. Now we hear that Barack and the Iranian president are having conversations on the phone, which is a good thing. which is a wonderful thing. But if you are going to really make us believe that you are committed to a brotherhood of nations, to a comity of nations, to collaboration with everyone, with the stroke of a pen, you can do as every president has done in history, issue a few pardons. And when you issue your pardons, begin with the 4 gentlemen who are still incarcerated in American prisons, who have never lifted one finger against a single U.S. interest, whose only crime is defending their homeland. President Obama, please, please pardon the Cuban 5. Thank you very much.